The Homestead Strike was not simply a wage dispute that turned violent, it was a test of whether the new industrial workplace would be ruled by organized labor or by corporate power backed by private force. That is the uncomfortable fact at the center of Homestead. A steel mill, built for furnaces, rollers, armor plate, and profit, became a contested zone where men on shore faced armed agents arriving by river. The company called it a matter of property and production. The workers understood it as a fight over their place inside the mill, their union, and the future of collective bargaining. Between those two claims stood a locked gate, a fortified plant, replacement labor, and the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. On the Monongahela River in July of 1892, covered barges carrying Pinkerton agents tried to enter the Carnegie steelworks at Homestead. The landing was meant to secure the plant for non-union labor. Instead, it triggered one of the most violent and consequential confrontations in American labor history. The first shot cannot be definitively assigned by reliable sources. That uncertainty matters. Homestead became a battle not only over steel, wages, and union power, but over memory itself. Who had acted in defense, who had provoked the violence, and who had the authority to command an industrial town. The place was Homestead, Pennsylvania, a few miles from Pittsburgh, where Carnegie Steel's Homestead Works stood along the Monongahela River. The mill was part of a region that had become central to America's rise into the age of steel. Steel from the Pittsburgh district fed the nation's infrastructure and industrial expansion. It was not a symbolic workplace on the edge of the economy. It was heavy industry at the center of national power. And Homestead was not a small private disagreement between an employer and a few employees. The major forces in the conflict were among the most important institutions of the Gilded Age. On one side stood Carnegie Steel Company, the industrial empire associated with Andrew Carnegie, one of the most famous businessmen in the United States. Managing the company's response at Homestead was Henry Clay Frick, a hard-driving executive already known for his role in coal and coke. On the other side stood the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, a union representing skilled labor in an industry where skill still carried leverage. Around them were thousands of workers, many of them not union members, who nevertheless supported the strike. And then there were the Pinkertons, private armed agents hired to do what the company could not easily do through ordinary negotiation, help retake access to the works and make way for replacement workers. That phrase, replacement workers, sounds procedural. At Homestead, it was explosive. To restart production without the locked out or striking workforce was to challenge the union's ability to bargain at all. The dispute began around wages and contract terms, but the wage issue cannot be separated from the deeper question: who controlled the mill floor? The skilled workers of the Amalgamated Association claimed a collective voice in the conditions of their labor. Carnegie Steel, under Frick's management, moved toward reducing that power and ending collective bargaining with the union. The contract was set to expire at the end of June or on July 1, 1892, depending on how sources phrased the deadline. Before that deadline arrived, negotiations broke down. Frick proposed wage reductions. The union resisted. But the stakes widened quickly. If the company could break the Amalgamated at Homestead, it could reshape labor relations not just inside one plant, but across a critical sector of American heavy industry. Andrew Carnegie's role made the conflict even more revealing. Carnegie was in Scotland during the crisis. Publicly, he had cultivated an image that could include sympathy toward labor and the responsibilities of wealth. At Homestead, however, company policy was executed by Frick, and the response became confrontation rather than compromise. That distance between Carnegie's public reputation and the company's conduct would become one of the enduring tensions of the story. Homestead forces the question of whether a corporation's moral identity can be separated from the methods it authorizes, supports, or permits when its power is challenged. Frick did not merely wait for the contract to expire. In late June of 1892, he locked out workers and fortified the plant. Workers gave the place a name, Fort Frick. According to accounts of the fortifications, the mill was surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire, pierced for rifles, and reinforced with measures that included water cannons and sniper towers. A workplace was being physically transformed into a security zone. The architecture itself communicated the breakdown of trust. The mill gates no longer marked the beginning of a workday. They marked a front line. The company's logic was clear enough. If the union and its supporters could control access to the works, the plant could not run on company terms. If Carnegie Steel could secure the property, bring in replacement labor, and resume operations, the strike could be broken. The workers understood this too. That is why the conflict over access became so intense. The battle at Homestead was not an accidental riot beside a factory. It was the violent expression of a struggle over entry, authority, and legitimacy. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency occupied a particular place in that world. In Gilded Age labor disputes, private security forces could function as a kind of quasi-police power, hired by employers to protect property, escort replacement workers, and confront strikers. Before modern labor law and public order standards had taken shape, this created a dangerous ambiguity. The Pinkertons were not the state militia. They were not local police acting under ordinary civic accountability. They were private agents, armed and organized, entering a community already mobilized against the company. At Homestead, Frick hired about 300 armed Pinkerton agents. The plan was to bring them by river because workers had blocked land access. The Pinkertons traveled in covered barges towed by the tugboat Little Bill, leaving from Davis Island on the Ohio River and moving toward the Homestead works. The tactical idea was straightforward: avoid the blocked gates, land on company property from the water, and secure the plant so non-union labor could be brought in. But a tactic that looks efficient from an office can become catastrophic on the ground. To the workers and townspeople watching the river, the barges did not look like neutral instruments of legal order. They looked like an armed force arriving undercover to break the strike. The river, the mill, and the town were no longer background details. They were part of the mechanism of conflict. When the Pinkertons tried to land near the mill in the early morning of July 6, 1892, the confrontation erupted. The battle lasted roughly 12 hours. Sources report rifle fire from Pinkertons armed with Winchester rifles. Workers and townspeople used improvised tactics from shore, including gunfire, barricades, attempts to burn or sink the barges, and according to multiple accounts, at least one cannon. 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons were killed, with some sources phrasing the toll as at least 3 Pinkertons and 7 workers killed during the battle and aftermath. The Pinkertons eventually surrendered. But even surrender did not end the damage. Afterward, the agents were assaulted while being marched through town, treatment that damaged public sympathy for the strikers. That shift in public perception would matter. In a conflict where the company had hired armed private agents to enter the works, the violence against surrendered men gave management a powerful narrative. The Union and its supporters could be portrayed as lawless and dangerous. Then the state entered openly. Pennsylvania Governor Robert Emory Pattison sent militia, or National Guard forces, to Homestead. On July 12, the plant was turned over to them. By mid-July, the mill was operating again with replacement workers. Later that month, Alexander Berkman, an anarchist not connected to the Union, attempted to assassinate Henry Clay Frick, further weakening public support for the strike. By November of 1892, the Amalgamated Association conceded defeat. The consequences lasted far beyond Homestead. Union influence in the steel industry was sharply reduced for decades. Rivers of Steel places the return of successful steel unionism with the Steel Workers Organizing Committee in the late 1930s. That long aftermath is why Homestead still matters. It shows how one local battle could reshape an entire industry's labor relations, and how private force, public authority, corporate strategy, and worker solidarity could collide in the making of modern industrial America. But before the barges, before the gunfire, and before Fort Frick became a name of warning, there was the place itself, Homestead on the Monongahela, a town and a mill pressed tightly against the river, where geography would help determine how power moved, where people gathered, and why one stretch of industrial waterfront became a battlefield. To understand why Homestead became the stage for such a concentrated conflict, it helps to slow the story down and look at the ground itself. Before anyone could argue over a contract deadline, before armed private agents tried to reach the works, before the name Fort Frick attached itself to the mill, there was a very particular landscape, a steel town on the Monongahela River, southeast of downtown Pittsburgh, built around an industrial plant whose position shaped almost everything that followed. Homestead, Pennsylvania, sat only a few miles from Pittsburgh, but in the late 19th century, it belonged to a wider world of river valleys, mills, rail lines, furnaces, smoke, and labor. The Monongahela Valley was one of the industrial corridors that helped make southwestern Pennsylvania central to America's rise into the Age of Steel. Coal, iron, transport routes, and capital converged there. Pittsburgh and the surrounding counties became nationally important because their mills produced steel for major American infrastructure and later wartime production. Homestead was one place in that larger system, but by 1892 it had become one of the most important. The Homestead Works stood along the Monongahela River. That fact can sound like background, but it was not background at all. The river was a working artery. It connected the mill to the industrial region around it. It created a boundary, a route, and a possible point of entry. On one side was the plant with its furnaces and mills. Around it was the town where workers and their families lived, close to the place that employed them. Nearby were other pieces of the same industrial landscape, including the broader steelmaking world that modern visitors encounter through rivers of steel sites along the Monongahela. The geography mattered because the dispute at Homestead was never only abstract. It was not fought in a courtroom or contained inside an office where managers and union representatives exchanged papers. It unfolded in a dense industrial setting where every road, gate, landing, fence line, and riverbank could take on practical meaning. When workers gathered, they gathered near a real plant with real access points. When the company thought about control, it had to think about physical control. Who could enter the works? Who could stand at the gates? Who could guard the perimeter? And who could keep production from resuming or help it resume? The town and the mill pressed against each other. That closeness intensified the conflict. A workplace dispute in a remote facility might remain partly hidden from the surrounding population. Homestead was different. The mill dominated local life. It was an employer, a source of wages, a source of danger, and a symbol of corporate authority. The people of the town could see the works. They could move toward it. They could observe changes at its edges. When the struggle sharpened, the surrounding community did not have to travel far to become part of it. This is one reason Homestead cannot be understood simply as a disagreement between a company and a union committee. The physical arrangement helped pull more people into the crisis. Workers who were not union members still lived in the same community, depended on the same industrial economy, and understood that the future of work inside the mill would affect more than the men formerly enrolled in the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. That broader local support will matter as the story moves inward, from the riverbank and the town toward the skilled jobs and bargaining power inside the works. For now, the main point is that Homestead's geography gave the conflict a shape. The riverfront plant was not an isolated backdrop. It was a contested object. Whoever controlled the Homestead Works controlled more than machinery. They controlled access to employment, the possibility of restarting production, and the practical future of the labor agreement. The mill's location along the Monongahela made it possible to imagine one path of approach by water, while the town around it made land access politically and physically difficult once the workers were mobilized. Later, that difference between land and river would become decisive. There is also a reason that the memory of Homestead remains attached to specific buildings and sites rather than only to written records. The story left marks in place. Today, one of the most important associated locations is the pump house area at 880 East Waterfront Drive in Munhall, Pennsylvania. The Homestead Works pump house dates to 1892 and now helps interpret the Battle of Homestead. It stands near the riverfront landscape where the industrial geography of the conflict can still be read: water, mill ground, and the approach from the Monongahela. The pump house is not important only because something later happened nearby. It is important because it helps modern visitors understand the original mechanics of the confrontation. The river was not decorative scenery. It was the route by which power could attempt to move. The plant was not just an employer. It was a place that could be held, guarded, entered, blocked, and transformed into a fortified zone. The pump house area anchors that reality in physical space. Another memory site stands in the town itself, the Bost Building at 623 East 8th Avenue in Homestead. It was built in 1892 as a hotel for Homestead's growing worker ward. During the strike, it served as headquarters for the Amalgamated Association. Today, it is a National Historic Landmark used by rivers of steel. The building matters because it represents the town side of the geography, the organizational, civic, and human side of the conflict. If the pump house points us toward the river landing and the industrial edge, the Bost building points us toward the workers' presence in Homestead as a community. Together, those two sites help frame the story without rushing ahead of it. One is associated with the industrial waterfront. The other is associated with Union headquarters and the town's organized response. Between them lies the deeper structure of the conflict: corporate property along the river, a workforce embedded in a tight community, and a valley whose entire economy revolved around steel. Rivers of Steel now interprets this landscape as part of a larger regional heritage area covering 8 southwestern Pennsylvania counties: Allegheny, Armstrong, Beaver, Butler, Fayette, Greene, Washington, and Westmoreland. That larger frame matters because Homestead was never just a single borough with a single mill. It was part of an industrial region where labor, capital, immigrant communities, skilled trades, transportation, and corporate ambition were all bound together. Across the Monongahela from the pump house area, the Carey blast furnaces are part of that wider heritage landscape. They remind us that steelmaking in this region was not confined to one plant. It was a network of sites, workers, technologies, and company decisions. Still, in 1892, the focus narrowed sharply to Homestead. The works along the river became the point where national questions took local form. How much authority would a corporation have over the organization of labor inside its own plant? Could skilled workers preserve collective bargaining in a major heavy industry? What happened when a town whose life depended on a mill resisted the company's effort to change the rules inside that mill? The answer to those questions depended partly on law, money, and management strategy, but it also depended on place. The Monongahela River offered a route. The mill offered a target and a prize. The town offered numbers, visibility, and solidarity. The surrounding industrial region gave the dispute national significance because steel from places like Homestead was tied to the material growth of the United States itself. Seen this way, Homestead was not an accidental battlefield. Its geography made certain choices possible and others dangerous. It allowed a labor dispute to become a struggle over space: the space inside the mill, the space at the gates, the space along the riverbank, and the civic space of a town that did not see the works as separate from its own life. That is why the next step is not to leave the landscape behind, but to move through it, into the mill itself. The river and town explain how the confrontation could gather force. The machinery, the skilled jobs, and the bargaining traditions inside the Homestead works explain what the fight was really about. Who would hold power in the workplace when steel was becoming one of the central industries of modern America? From the riverbank and the town streets, the story now moves inside the Homestead works, where the conflict was not only about wages, but about authority. The steel mill was a place of heat, machinery, timing, danger, and hierarchy. It was also a workplace where skill still mattered deeply. In the late 19th century steel industry, skilled workers could claim a kind of power that was not written into corporate charters, but was felt every day on the mill floor. At Homestead, that claim was represented by the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. The Amalgamated Association was not simply a protest group gathered in a moment of crisis. It was an established union of skilled iron and steel workers, and at Homestead, it stood for the principle that workers with specialized knowledge should bargain collectively with the company. Its members were men whose work was central to production, men who understood furnaces, rolling processes, timing, temperatures, and the practical realities of turning raw material into finished steel. Their bargaining power came from the fact that steelmaking was not yet a fully diskilled process. Machines and capital mattered, but so did the workers who knew how to run them. That is what made the Homestead struggle so significant. Carnegie Steel was not merely trying to lower a payroll line. The company was trying to change the balance of power inside one of the most important industrial workplaces in the United States. The Homestead Works, located along the Monongahela River, a few miles from Pittsburgh, stood in a region central to America's rise into the age of steel. The steel made in places like Homestead fed the infrastructure of a growing nation. It was tied to railroads, buildings, machinery, and later to armor plate and military production. Control of such a workplace was not a minor matter. Whoever controlled the terms of labor inside the mill helped control the pace, cost, and discipline of industrial production. For Carnegie Steel, the presence of a strong, skilled union was a limit on managerial freedom. It meant that some decisions could not simply be imposed from above without negotiation. The union contract gave organized workers a formal place in determining wages and conditions. In a modern corporation built around scale, investment, and efficiency, that was a direct challenge to managerial authority. For the Amalgamated Association, collective bargaining was not a privilege granted at the company's convenience. It was the institutional expression of skilled labor's standing in the mill. The union's position rested on an older industrial idea that the men who possessed the skill to make steel had earned a voice in the terms under which steel would be made. This was the workplace struggle behind the strike. It is easy, from a distance, to reduce Homestead to one dramatic image: armed Pinkerton agents approaching in barges, or workers and townspeople gathered along the riverbank. But those scenes came later. Beneath them was a slower contest over who had the right to set the rules inside the works. Henry Clay Frick, managing Carnegie Steel's response at Homestead, proposed wage reductions and moved toward ending collective bargaining with the union. Those two issues became inseparable. A wage reduction by itself could be understood as a hard negotiation in a volatile industry. But when wage reductions were joined to an effort to weaken or remove the union's bargaining position, the dispute became something larger. It became a test of whether the Amalgamated Association would remain a recognized force inside the mill at all. That distinction matters. Workers did not see the company's position only as an argument over dollars. They saw it as an attempt to strip organized, skilled labor of authority. If management could impose wage terms without meaningful negotiation, then the union's power would be reduced not just for one contract period, but for the future. The question was whether Homestead would remain a union stronghold or whether Carnegie Steel would bring the works under more direct corporate control. And yet, the union's strength at Homestead cannot be measured simply by counting union members. Only a minority of Homestead workers belonged to the Amalgamated Association. That fact is crucial because it complicates the story. The union represented skilled labor, but the Homestead workforce was larger and more varied than the union roles. The mill depended on many kinds of labor, including workers who were not members of the skilled union. Some held less protected positions. Some had less bargaining power. Some were outside the formal structure of the Amalgamated Association altogether. If the strike had involved only the signed membership of the union, the conflict might have been narrower. But sources report that thousands of non-union workers supported the strike. That support changed the meaning of the confrontation. It showed that Homestead was not simply a closed dispute between a company and a small body of organized craftsmen. The union may have represented a minority of workers formally, but its struggle spoke to a wider fear among the workforce that if Carnegie Steel broke the bargaining power of the skilled union, the consequences would reach far beyond union members. Non-union workers could understand that a defeat for the Amalgamated Association might strengthen management over everyone in the mill. That broader support also helps explain why the conflict became rooted in the town itself. Homestead was not a place where the mill could be separated neatly from community life. Workers lived nearby. Families depended on wages from the works. Local businesses, boarding houses, streets, and public spaces were tied to the rhythms of production. When thousands of non-union workers supported the strike, the dispute expanded from a formal labor negotiation into a community defense of workplace power. The company, for its part, had reason to see this solidarity as a direct obstacle. To regain control of production, Carnegie Steel needed more than an agreement on pay. It needed access to the plant, a workforce willing to operate it, and the ability to restart production without submitting to the union's claim. That is why replacement workers became central to the company's strategy, and why control of gates, river approaches, and the physical works would soon become so important. But before the plant was fortified, before private agents were sent toward the river landing, the essential conflict was already visible. Carnegie Steel wanted to manage Homestead on terms set by the company. The Amalgamated Association wanted the company to continue recognizing skilled labor as a collective bargaining power. Non-union workers in large numbers supported the union's stand because they understood that the outcome would shape the entire workplace. This is one reason the Homestead Strike became a defining case in American labor history. It was not merely a fight about whether one group of men would earn more or less under a new wage scale. It was about the structure of power in heavy industry during the Gilded Age. It asked whether a corporation that owned the plant, the machinery, and the capital also had the sole right to determine the conditions of production. And it asked whether workers, through organization and solidarity, could claim a durable voice inside the industrial system they made possible. At Homestead, skill was both economic and political. Skilled workers were valuable because they knew the work. They were dangerous to management because they could organize around that knowledge. The Amalgamated Association turned practical expertise into bargaining power. Carnegie Steel's effort to reduce that power was part of a larger movement in American industry towards centralized corporate control, managerial discipline, and the use of replacement labor when organized workers resisted. The stakes were sharpened by the timing. The union contract was approaching expiration at the end of June or on July 1, 1892, depending on how different sources phrased the deadline. Negotiations were breaking down. Wage reductions were on the table. The future of collective bargaining at Homestead was in doubt. Each side understood that the contract dispute could decide more than the next period's wages. It could decide who would command the mill. This was the struggle hidden inside the machinery, not hidden from the workers who lived it, but often hidden when the story is remembered only through violence. The gunfire would come later. The Pinkertons would come later. The fortified fence would come later. First came the contest over recognition, wages, skill, and authority. And over that contest stood two figures whose public roles did not align neatly. Andrew Carnegie, whose name was attached to the company and whose public reputation included sympathy toward labor, was away in Scotland during the crisis. Henry Clay Frick remained in command of the company's response at Homestead. The workplace struggle had been set in motion. Now decisions at the top of Carnegie Steel would determine how far the company was willing to go to win it. The workplace struggle had been set in motion inside the Homestead Works, but the next decisions would be made above the shop floor. They would come from offices, letters, management policy, and the authority of men whose names carried different meanings in public. At the center of that tension were Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick. Carnegie's name was on the company. His fortune was tied to the mills along the Monongahela Valley, and his public image had long been more complicated than that of a simple industrial hardliner. He could speak in the language of progress, improvement, and social responsibility. He would become one of the most famous philanthropists in American history. In public memory, Carnegie is often associated with libraries, education, and the idea that great wealth carried obligations beyond private accumulation. But Homestead placed that image under pressure. During the crisis, Andrew Carnegie was in Scotland. The physical distance matters, but it does not settle the question of responsibility. It would be too simple to say that because Carnegie was abroad, he was outside the conflict. It would also be too simple to treat Henry Clay Frick as acting in a world entirely of his own making. Carnegie Steel was Carnegie's company, and the conflict unfolded under the authority of the corporation he had built. Yet in the daily management of the Homestead response, Frick was the man in command. That arrangement shaped the crisis. Carnegie remained the public name, the symbol of the company's success and its claimed moral standing. Frick became the executive presence on the ground, the manager associated with wage reductions, the hardening of policy, and the move away from collective bargaining with the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. Frick was not merely administering a routine negotiation. He was making choices about power. At Homestead, the issue was not only whether the men would accept lower pay. The issue was whether the company would continue to recognize the union's role in setting the terms of work for skilled labor. The wage question and the bargaining question became inseparable. A reduction in wages could be presented as an economic measure, a response to business conditions or production costs. But when tied to the future of the union contract, it became something larger, an attempt to change who had standing inside the mill. That is why Frick's role is central. He proposed wage reductions, and he moved toward ending collective bargaining with the union. In practical terms, this meant that the Amalgamated Association was no longer being treated simply as a partner in a difficult pay negotiation. It was being treated as an obstacle to company authority. For the skilled workers, this distinction mattered deeply. The Amalgamated Association represented only a minority of the total Homestead workforce, but its position inside the mill carried weight beyond its membership count. Skilled men had used organization to defend wages, control, and recognition in a dangerous industry where knowledge of the process still gave labor leverage. Thousands of non-union workers supported the strike, showing that the dispute had a social reach far wider than the union roles. Many workers understood that if management could defeat the skilled union, the consequences would not stop with the union men. Frick's strategy challenged that entire arrangement. It was a move toward a different kind of mill, one where management alone would decide the terms of employment and where organized labor would no longer have recognized authority in the workplace. In the world of Carnegie Steel, that was not a minor administrative adjustment. It was a restructuring of power. Carnegie's absence made the moral drama sharper. He was not standing at the gate. He was not leading guards into the works. He was not the one whose name workers would attach to the fortified plant. That name would be Frick's. Yet Carnegie's distance from Homestead did not erase the fact that the conflict was unfolding on behalf of his company and his business system. The separation between the man abroad and the manager in command created a useful public ambiguity. Carnegie could remain associated with ideals, while Frick became associated with enforcement. This is one reason Homestead has remained such a powerful episode in the history of American labor. It asks how responsibility works inside a corporation. Is responsibility located only with the manager who signs the orders, receives the reports, and directs the immediate response? Or does it extend to the owner whose wealth, authority, and corporate structure make those decisions possible? At Homestead, the answer is not found in a single dramatic gesture. It lies in the relationship between absence and command. Frick's command also had a particular character. He did not wait passively for negotiations to fail and then improvise. The company prepared for confrontation. The later fortification of the plant, the lockout, and the hiring of armed Pinkerton agents would make that preparation unmistakable. But the groundwork was laid earlier in the decision to treat the contract dispute as a test of authority. Once management chose that path, compromise became harder. A wage cut might be negotiated. A contract term might be adjusted. But the future of collective bargaining was a more fundamental matter. If the union accepted a settlement that weakened its recognition, it risked losing the very basis of its power. If the company accepted continued bargaining on the old terms, it would leave in place the worker organization Frick sought to limit or end. Both sides could see that the contract was becoming a line between two systems of control. The public contrast between Carnegie and Frick also shaped how the conflict would be remembered. Carnegie's reputation as a pro-labor philanthropist did not fit comfortably with a company policy that moved toward breaking the union at Homestead. That contradiction is not incidental to the story. It is one of its central features. Gilded Age industrial power often wore more than one face. It could speak the language of uplift and civilization while also using lockouts, replacement labor, private police, and armed force to secure control over production. Frick's face was the harder one. He became the visible expression of company discipline. To workers, he represented the direct threat, wage reductions, the end of bargaining, and the possibility that the mill would be reopened without them. To the company, he represented resolve. His task was to make Homestead manageable from the standpoint of ownership. That meant reducing the union's ability to dictate terms inside one of the most important steelworks in the Carnegie system. In the archive of the strike, this division of roles can tempt us toward a simple character study: Carnegie the absent idealist, Frick the present enforcer. But the history is more revealing if those roles are held together. Carnegie's absence allowed Frick to become the operational commander, but Frick's authority came from the corporate world Carnegie had made. The Homestead crisis therefore complicates both men at once. It darkens Carnegie's public image, and it explains why Frick's name became so closely attached to confrontation. The workers understood the stakes in their own terms. The fight was not only with one executive personality. It was with a company determined to decide whether the union would continue to have a place in the mill. The men at Homestead had reason to believe that if the company succeeded there, the result would echo beyond one works on the Monongahela River. In steel, as in other heavy industries of the late 19th century, one local defeat could become a signal to employers elsewhere. So the crisis moved toward its deadline with two forms of distance in play. Carnegie was distant in geography, abroad in Scotland, while events sharpened in Pennsylvania. Frick was close to the machinery of decision, turning wage policy and contract negotiation into a test of corporate command. Between them stood the workers of Homestead, watching the company's position harden and understanding that the expiration of the agreement would not be a mere calendar event. It would be the moment when proposals became consequences. The wage reductions, the question of recognition, and the future of collective bargaining were converging. The contract's end was approaching, described in sources as the end of June or July 1st, 1892. By then, the dispute was no longer only about what skilled men would be paid. It was about whether the union would still have the power to bargain at all, and whether Carnegie Steel would accept any authority inside the Homestead Works except its own. The contract deadline was approaching, not as a single dramatic hour, but as a narrowing corridor. Each day at the end of June, 1892, made the same question harder to avoid. Would Carnegie Steel continue to bargain with the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers at Homestead, or would management use the expiration of the agreement to remake authority inside the works? Sources describe the deadline in slightly different phrasing. Some place the contract's expiration at the end of June. Others state it as July 1st, 1892. The difference matters less than the pressure it created. Everyone involved understood that the existing agreement was running out. When it ended, the working relationship inside the mill would no longer be protected by the same terms. What had been negotiated before could be withdrawn. What had been recognized before could be denied. This is where the Homestead dispute became more than a wage dispute, even though wages were at the center of the immediate conflict. Henry Clay Frick proposed reductions. For the company, wage cuts could be presented as a matter of business policy, a calculation about costs, markets, and production. For the skilled workers, they carried another meaning. Wages were tied to standing. They reflected not only how much a man took home, but whether his skill, his craft, and his union's bargaining power were still acknowledged by the company that depended on his labor. At Homestead, the Amalgamated Association represented skilled labor's claim to negotiate collectively. It did not include every worker in the plant. Only a minority of Homestead workers were union members. But that fact did not make the conflict small. Thousands of non-union workers supported the strike, and that support revealed something crucial about the atmosphere inside the town and mill. The issue had spread beyond the formal boundaries of union membership. Many workers understood that if the Amalgamated Association was broken, the balance of power would shift for everyone. The negotiations before the deadline therefore carried a double weight. On paper, management and union representatives were addressing pay. In practice, they were also testing whether collective bargaining would survive at Homestead. If the union accepted deep reductions on the company's terms, its ability to speak for skilled workers would be weakened. If the company refused to recognize the union as a continuing bargaining power, the wage issue became a doorway into something larger, the company's claim to govern the workplace without organized labor standing in between. This was the point at which time itself became a weapon. A labor contract is a document, but it is also a clock. While it remains in force, both sides operate within its language and expectations. As expiration approaches, the side willing to wait, prepare, and impose consequences can gain leverage. At Homestead, the company's position hardened as the end of the agreement drew near. Frick was not only offering wage reductions. He was moving toward ending collective bargaining with the union. For the men inside the Homestead Works, this raised the stakes of every meeting and every unanswered proposal. A wage cut might be endured, resisted, or renegotiated, but the loss of recognition threatened the mechanism by which future disputes would be handled. Without collective bargaining, there would be no established union channel through which skilled workers could press claims about pay, conditions, or the authority attached to their jobs. The company would deal with labor on different terms, and likely from a much stronger position. The tension was sharpened by the nature of steelmaking itself. The Homestead Works was not a quiet workplace where authority could be abstract. It was a place of furnaces, rolling mills, armor plate, open hearth production, and dangerous timing. Skill mattered because mistakes carried consequences. Experienced workers understood the rhythms of production and the hazards of the machinery. Their claim to bargaining power rested partly on that knowledge. They were not simply asking for better pay as isolated individuals. They were asserting that the men who made the steel had a voice in the industrial order that steel was building. For Carnegie Steel, that assertion was precisely the problem. The company's managers wanted control over production, costs, hiring, and discipline. A recognized union inside the mill placed limits on that control. It created a rival source of authority, not equal to management, but real enough to affect decisions. The contract deadline made that conflict unavoidable. Once the agreement expired, management could decide whether to renew the relationship or use the opening to force a new one. Andrew Carnegie remained abroad in Scotland while this process unfolded, a fact that gives the negotiations their peculiar distance. His name still defined the company in public. His reputation still carried the language of uplift and sympathy toward labor. But at Homestead, Henry Clay Frick held command. Frick's decisions gave concrete form to the company's intentions. The dispute was not being settled by public sentiment or philanthropic image. It was being driven by management strategy. As June moved toward its close, the workers were not only listening to proposals, they were reading signals. A company that merely wanted lower wages might continue bargaining until a compromise was reached. A company determined to end union power would prepare for confrontation. The difference could be seen in tone, timing, and refusal. Negotiations broke down before the contract expired. That breakdown was not a pause in the story. It was a turning point. When talks fail near a deadline, uncertainty spreads quickly. Men have to ask whether they will still have jobs, whether they will be permitted to enter the works, whether their union will be recognized, and whether replacement labor will be brought in. In Homestead, those questions were inseparable from the geography already established in this story. The mill along the Monongahela River, the town beside it, the routes in and out, and the workers who lived close enough to see company policy become physical fact. The community understood that the expiration of the agreement could change daily life. The Homestead Works was not a remote plant separated from the town. It was embedded in the life of Homestead and the surrounding industrial landscape near Pittsburgh. A struggle over bargaining inside the mill would be felt in homes, streets, meeting places, and along the riverfront. The contract deadline therefore had a public presence. It was not hidden in an office. It moved through the town as expectation, rumor, and preparation. The company's proposed wage reductions gave the conflict its immediate language, but the deeper issue was authority. Who would decide the terms of work? Who would control access to the plant? Who would determine whether organized skilled workers had a recognized place in the industrial system? The Amalgamated Association saw the contract as a protection of collective power. Frick saw the deadline as an opportunity to break that power or reduce it sharply. This is why the failed negotiations mattered so much. They marked the point where compromise ceased to be the likely path. Once the existing agreement reached its end, the company could act. The workers could resist. Each side could claim legitimacy, management in the name of property and business control, labor in the name of negotiated rights and the dignity of skilled work. But those claims were no longer moving toward settlement. They were moving toward enforcement. By the final days of June, the Homestead conflict had entered a new phase. The language of bargaining remained, but the logic of confrontation was taking over. A deadline that might have produced a renewed contract instead exposed the unresolved question at the center of the mill, whether Carnegie Steel would share any measure of authority with organized labor. And as the contract ran out, that question began to take material form. The boundary between workplace and battleground started to harden. Soon, the dispute would no longer be visible only in wage proposals and broken negotiations. It would appear in wood, wire, openings for rifles, guarded approaches, and a fortified plant that workers would come to call Fort Frick. By the final days of June, the Homestead dispute was no longer confined to the negotiating table. The disagreement over wages, recognition, and authority had begun to show itself in the landscape of the mill. What had been argued in proposals and counterproposals was now being built into the physical boundaries of the Homestead Works. Henry Clay Frick's response to the breakdown was not only administrative, it was architectural. In late June 1892, as the union contract neared its end, Frick moved to lock out workers and fortify the plant. The workers gave the fortified works a name that captured both the scale of the change and the man they held responsible. They called it Fort Frick. The name was not accidental. It suggested that the steelworks, a place of furnaces, mills, rolling machinery, and skilled labor, had been transformed into something closer to a military position. The Homestead Works had always been powerful in a physical sense. It dominated the riverfront. It shaped the town's economy. Its machinery organized the hours and movements of thousands of men. But Frick's fortifications changed what that power looked like. The mill was no longer only a workplace owned by Carnegie Steel. It was becoming a defended enclosure. Accounts of the fortifications describe a long fence thrown around the works. PBS reports that the fence was 3 miles long and 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire and pierced with openings for rifles. Rivers of Steel describes Fort Frick as including barbed wire fencing, water cannons, and sniper towers. These details matter because they show that management was preparing for more than a difficult negotiation. The company was preparing to control access, hold ground, and defend the plant against the people who had worked inside it. A fence can be an ordinary industrial boundary. Factories often had walls, gates, and watchmen. But this fence had a different meaning. Its height made it a barrier. The barbed wire made it hostile to crossing. The rifle openings suggested that men inside the works might fire outward, or at least that the company wanted the possibility to be visible. Water cannons added another layer of defensive planning, a way to repel crowds without depending only on firearms. Sniper towers, as described by Rivers of Steel, raised the line of sight above the ground and turned the mill's edge into a field of surveillance. The physical plant had become part of the conflict. That transformation is easy to miss if the Homestead story is told only as a sequence of decisions: failed negotiations, lockout, Pinkertons, battle, militia, defeat. But before the armed confrontation on the river, there was this quieter, deliberate act of conversion. A steel mill was being remade into a security zone. The boundary between inside and outside, already charged by the question of who had authority in the workplace, became visible in wood, wire, and guarded approaches. For workers in Homestead, the message was plain. The company was not merely saying that the old agreement might expire. It was preparing to exclude them. It was preparing to operate the works without accepting their collective power at the gates or inside the departments where skilled men had once held influence. In that sense, Fort Frick was both a structure and a statement. It declared that Carnegie Steel would treat control of the plant as a question of property, force, and access. This was especially significant because the dispute at Homestead was not only about individual pay envelopes. It was about whether the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers would continue to have a recognized place in the governance of the mill. The skilled workers represented by the union had long claimed that their knowledge and coordination gave them a legitimate voice in how the work was organized and paid. Frick's fortifications answered that claim in physical form. Authority would not be shared at the boundary. It would be defended. The location of the Homestead Works intensified the meaning of these preparations. The plant stood along the Monongahela River near Pittsburgh, in a town whose life was bound tightly to the steel industry. The mill was not isolated from the community. It sat beside the river and beside the lives of the workers who depended on it. When its perimeter was hardened, the change affected more than company property. It altered the relationship between the town and the works. The place where wages were earned, disputes were negotiated, and industrial skill was exercised became a place guarded against its own workforce. Fort Frick also revealed the tactical problem that would shape the next stage of the conflict. If workers and townspeople could control the approaches to the plant, then the company could not simply bring in replacement labor by ordinary means. Access was power. Gates, roads, rail connections, and the riverfront were not neutral pieces of geography. They were routes through which authority could be asserted or blocked. By fortifying the mill, Frick was preparing for a contest in which the ability to enter the works would determine whether Carnegie Steel could restart production on its own terms. The fortifications also gave the coming conflict a moral and political charge. To management, the reinforced plant could be presented as protection of property. The company owned the works, and Frick could argue that he had a right to secure them. To workers, the same structures looked like preparation for strike-breaking and violence. They did not see a neutral defense system. They saw a company building a fortress against the men whose labor had made the mill productive. That difference in interpretation was central to the Homestead crisis. Both sides claimed order. Carnegie Steel claimed managerial control and property rights. Workers claimed negotiated rights and the legitimacy of collective action. Fort Frick made those claims confront each other in material form. A rifle opening in a fence was not an argument on paper. It was a warning. A tower was not a wage proposal. It was a sign that the company expected resistance and had prepared to meet it. The nickname itself carried the workers' interpretation into public memory. Fort Frick made Henry Clay Frick personally visible in the structure. It connected the fence, wire, water cannons, and towers to the manager directing Carnegie Steel's response. Andrew Carnegie remained abroad in Scotland, but the fortified works bore Frick's name in the language of the town. The phrase turned the mill into a symbol of his policy: no retreat on authority, no easy compromise with the union, and no assumption that the old relationship between skilled labor and management would survive. There is also a quieter irony in the transformation. Steel mills were already dangerous places. The Homestead Works contained heat, machinery, noise, and risk as part of ordinary production. Workers understood that danger as part of industrial life. But Fort Frick introduced a different kind of danger. It was not the danger of molten metal or heavy equipment. It was the danger of armed confrontation around the right to work, the right to bargain, and the right to enter or exclude. In that sense, the plant's fortification blurred categories that usually remain separate. Workplace, private property, public order, and battlefield began to overlap. The mill fence became a political line. Inside was the company's claim to command. Outside were workers, families, and townspeople watching the place where their livelihoods had been enclosed against them. The dispute had moved from negotiation into a struggle over space. By late June 1892, the fortified Homestead Works stood as evidence that Carnegie Steel was no longer waiting passively for the contract to expire. The company was arranging the ground on which the next phase would be fought. The old mechanisms of bargaining had failed to produce agreement. In their place stood a perimeter designed to hold the plant for management. Fort Frick did not by itself fire a shot. It did not settle the wage scale. It did not bring replacement workers through the gates. But it made visible the direction of the conflict. The works had been enclosed, hardened, and prepared. The question now was not only whether the union contract would survive. It was whether the workers themselves would be allowed to remain part of the mill's future at all. As June gave way to July, that question would be answered not in theory, but in acts of exclusion. Departments would close. Men would be kept out. The fortified plant would become the center of a lockout, and Carnegie Steel would move from preparation to enforcement. The fence around the Homestead Works had changed the meaning of the mill. It was no longer only a place where iron and steel were shaped by heat, skill, and machinery. By the last days of June 1892, it had become a line of separation. On one side stood Carnegie Steel's claim to control its property and production. On the other stood workers who understood that the closing of a gate could mean more than a temporary stoppage. It could mean the end of their authority inside the works. The lockout made that separation real. The sources preserve the timing in more than one way, and the distinction matters. PBS reports that on June 29th, Henry Clay Frick closed the Open Hearth and Armor Plate mills, locking out 3,800 men. Britannica gives the escalation in a different phrasing, stating that on July 2nd, Frick fired all 3,800 workers. These are not identical descriptions. One emphasizes the closing of departments and the exclusion of workers from the plant. The other describes a sweeping dismissal of the workforce, but the practical effect pointed in the same direction. Carnegie Steel was no longer simply waiting for the contract question to resolve itself. The company was moving to break the union's hold at Homestead and to prepare the works for operation under management's terms. That shift was crucial because the conflict had never been only a dispute over a wage scale. The wage reductions proposed by Frick were tied to a larger question: whether the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers would continue to bargain for skilled labor inside the Homestead Works. The expiration of the agreement at the end of June, or on July 1st, depending on source phrasing, gave management an opening. Once the old contract was gone, the company could treat the absence of agreement not as a reason to continue negotiation, but as a reason to impose a new order. In industrial terms, a lockout reversed the usual image of a strike. Workers were not merely walking away from their jobs to pressure an employer. Here, the employer was using access to the workplace as leverage. The mill, already enclosed and fortified, became the instrument. To be locked out was to be told that the machines, furnaces, yards, and gates were no longer shared spaces of labor under a negotiated system. They were company property first, and entry would depend on acceptance of company authority. For the men at Homestead, the closing of the open hearth and armor plate mills carried a sharp message. These were not abstract departments on a company chart. They were parts of the industrial organism that gave Homestead its economic life. Open hearth production and armor plate connected the works to the most advanced and valuable sectors of steelmaking. To close those departments was to touch the center of the plant's importance, and to make clear that management was willing to interrupt production in order to reshape labor relations. The figure repeated in both accounts, 3,800 men, conveys the scale of the decision. This was not a dispute involving only a handful of Union officers or a single crew of skilled workers. Earlier in the conflict, only a minority of Homestead workers belonged to the Amalgamated Association, but thousands of non-union workers supported the strike. That broader support made the lockout more than a technical labor action against union members. It affected a working community whose daily life was bound to the mill, the river, and the town built around industrial employment. At Homestead, the company's move also forced a change in worker strategy. As long as negotiations continued, the struggle could be imagined as a contest of proposals, wage scales, tonnage rates, recognition, deadlines. Once the works were fortified and the men were excluded, the conflict became spatial. Who could enter the plan? Who could control the approaches? Who could prevent the company from bringing in replacement labor? This is why the lockout cannot be separated from the physical transformation described by workers as Fort Frick. The fence, the barbed wire, the rifle openings, the water cannons, and the sniper towers were not decorative signs of tension. They were a security system built for the moment when bargaining failed. Once men were locked out or fired, the fortified plant could serve its intended purpose, to hold the works for management while the company looked beyond the existing workforce. The movement toward replacement labor was the central consequence. If Carnegie Steel could restart production with non-union workers, the Amalgamated Association's leverage would collapse. A union in a steel mill depended not only on formal recognition, but on its ability to stop or control production through the skilled workers who knew the processes. If the company could remove those workers, protect the plant, and bring in replacements, it could show that production did not require bargaining with the union at all. That was the deeper contest hidden inside the word lockout. It was not only about who stood outside the gate on a particular morning. It was about whether the company could detach the mill from the organized workforce that had claimed a voice within it. Management's goal was not simply to survive a stoppage. It was to reopen under conditions that would leave the union without practical power. For the workers and townspeople, this was not difficult to read. Homestead was close enough to Pittsburgh to be part of the region's vast industrial network, but it was also a town whose rhythms were set by the works along the Monongahela River. When the company hardened the plant and then excluded thousands of men, the dispute moved into the streets and approaches around the mill. Workers understood that if replacement labor entered the works, the battle over recognition might be lost before any formal settlement was reached. So the conflict began to take on a defensive shape from the workers' side. The object was not only to protest wage reductions. It was to prevent the company from operating the plant without them. Control of the gates, roads, and access points became an extension of collective bargaining by other means. The union's formal strength may have rested with skilled members of the Amalgamated Association, but the ability to sustain resistance depended on wider support among non-union workers and the town itself. This broad support complicated Carnegie Steel's plans. A fortified mill could be defended from within, but replacement workers still had to be brought to the property. If land access was blocked or watched by workers, the company needed another route. The Monongahela River, which had always been part of the industrial geography of Homestead, now became part of the tactical geography of the conflict. That was one of the quiet turning points at the end of June and beginning of July. The river was not only a backdrop. It was a possible entrance. The mill stood along the water, and water access offered a way to reach company property without moving directly through worker-controlled approaches on land. In a dispute where the gates had become contested, the river suggested a different kind of gate. The lockout also exposed a larger feature of the Gilded Age labor order. There was no modern system of labor law capable of containing the dispute through recognized procedures. The question of who had authority inside the mill was being answered through property control, private arrangements, and force. Carnegie Steel could fortify its works. Workers could organize to resist replacement labor. And between those positions lay a dangerous vacuum. Who would enforce order, and in whose interest? At this stage, Frick's course had become clear. Negotiation had failed to preserve the old arrangement. The plant had been enclosed. Thousands of men had been excluded from work, whether described through PBS's account of the June 29th closing and lockout or Britannica's account of the July 2nd firing. The company's practical objective was to restart production without surrendering to the union. But to do that, Carnegie Steel needed more than fences. It needed men who could secure the plant for non-union labor. It needed a force able to enter the works despite local resistance. And because the roads and gates were no longer reliable channels of access, attention turned to the river. The lockout had created the conditions for the next escalation. The company had a fortified plant, a displaced workforce, and a plan to resume operations with replacement labor. What it did not yet have was physical control secure enough to make that plan work. For that, Frick turned to a private institution already associated with industrial conflict across the United States, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Soon, the struggle over who could enter Homestead works would move from the locked gates to the dark water of the Monongahela. The locked gates at Homestead had solved one problem for Carnegie Steel, but created another. The company had separated the workforce from the mill. It had enclosed the plant behind fences, wire, and guarded approaches. It had made clear that Henry Clay Frick intended to reopen the works on company terms, with non-union labor if necessary. But a fortified plant was useful only if the company could actually occupy it, defend it, and bring new workers inside. That was the practical problem now facing Frick. The men locked out of the Homestead works had not simply gone home and waited. Workers and townspeople had organized around the plant. Land access had become difficult, and in some accounts, effectively blocked. The roads and gates that ordinarily connected the mill to the town were now part of a contested zone. If replacement workers were to be brought in, the company needed protection. If the plant was to be restarted, management needed a force that could enter the works without relying on the usual approaches. So Frick turned to a private organization that already occupied a particular place in the American imagination, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. By 1892, the Pinkerton name was not obscure. It was associated with detection, security, armed guards, and the protection of property. In labor conflicts, Pinkerton agents could function as more than watchmen and less than soldiers, occupying the unsettled space between private employment and public authority. They were hired by companies, paid by private interests, and deployed in moments when managers believed ordinary local control was not enough. At Homestead, that meant they were not being brought in to investigate a crime after the fact. They were being brought in as an armed force before the plant reopened. Their job was to help secure the Homestead works for non-union labor. In the language of the company, this could be framed as protection of property and the restoration of order. In the eyes of many workers, it looked like an invasion by hired gunmen sent to break a strike. The number mattered. Frick hired 300 armed Pinkerton agents. This was not a handful of guards posted at a doorway. It was a private force large enough to alter the balance of power inside the plant if it could get there. Their presence would allow the company to hold the mill long enough to bring in replacement workers and resume production. That, in turn, would weaken the union's ability to use control of access as leverage. The plan depended on geography. Homestead Works stood along the Monongahela River, a few miles from Pittsburgh. Earlier in the conflict, that river had been part of the industrial setting, a channel for movement, supply, and production in the Monongahela Valley. Now it became a tactical route. If the locked-out workers and their supporters made the landward entrances unreliable, then the river offered another way in. A barge could approach the company's property from the water. Men could be landed near the works. Once inside, they could occupy the plant and hold it for the arrival of non-union labor. This is why the river route mattered so deeply. It was not incidental scenery. It was the answer to a security problem created by the lockout itself. Frick had a plant enclosed against the workers. The workers had the surrounding community and land approaches under pressure. The company response was to use the Monongahela as an alternative gate. The Pinkertons would travel in covered barges, towed toward Homestead by the tugboat Little Bill. Their movement would begin from Davis Island on the Ohio River, according to Rivers of Steel's account, and then proceed toward the mill. The plan was to approach in darkness and arrive before the town could fully respond. The tactical logic was clear. Avoid the blocked roads, avoid the watched gates, and enter company property from the river before organized resistance could assemble in force. But the same logic also revealed the danger. Sending 300 armed men into a town already mobilized against the company did not remove the possibility of confrontation. It concentrated it. The operation treated the river as a solution, but the river landing would also become a focal point, a narrow place where two claims of authority would meet. One claim belonged to Carnegie Steel. The company owned the plant. Frick had locked out the workers. Management intended to resume production. From that perspective, bringing armed guards onto company property was part of enforcing ownership and reopening business. The other claim belonged to the locked-out workers and the broader community that supported them. They believed the company was trying to destroy collective bargaining, replace skilled men, and reduce the union's role in the mill's future. To them, the Pinkertons were not neutral keepers of the peace. They were the physical instrument of strike breaking. That difference in interpretation was not a detail around the edges of the story. It was the heart of the conflict. The same private force could be described as guards protecting property or as armed agents imposing corporate power. In the Gilded Age, before modern labor law and public order standards had taken their later form, these distinctions were often unresolved until violence forced a public reckoning. The Pinkerton Plan at Homestead exposes that older world of industrial conflict. Public police power, private property rights, local community action, and labor organization overlapped uneasily. When a company hired armed men to secure a workplace, those men did not carry the same legitimacy as state militia or public officers. But in practice, they could perform functions that looked very much like policing. They could guard entrances, control movement, defend property, and assist in the introduction of replacement labor. That made them quasi-police in the labor disputes of the period, private agents acting in situations that affected public order. Their authority came from contract and property, not from election, statute, or public command. Yet the consequences of their deployment spilled far beyond company property. At Homestead, their arrival would affect an entire town. The problem was sharpened by the fortified condition of the works. Frick had already transformed the mill into what workers called Fort Frick. Fences and rifle openings had signaled preparation for conflict. The lockout then removed thousands of men from the workplace and placed them outside its boundaries. Hiring the Pinkertons was the next step in that sequence. It added human force to the physical barrier. The company could not rely on the fence alone. It needed armed men behind it. The workers understood that as well. If the Pinkertons succeeded in entering the plant, the company would be much closer to restarting operations without the union. If they failed, the locked-out workers would demonstrate that local resistance still controlled access to the mill. In that sense, the Pinkerton operation was not merely a security arrangement. It was a test of sovereignty over the Homestead works. Who could decide who entered? Who could decide whether production resumed? Who had the power to turn a steel mill from a unionized workplace into a non-union plant? The law did not provide a calm answer in advance. Instead, the answer would be fought over in space, at the gates, along the fence, and finally at the river landing. The Monongahela became the path by which a private security force attempted to bypass the town and enter the industrial stronghold that Frick had prepared. For the men aboard the barges, the mission may have been described in practical terms: reach the mill, land on company property, secure the works. For the men watching from Homestead, the same movement meant that the company had chosen armed intervention rather than settlement. The river would carry not just guards, but the next stage of the lockout. The plan depended on timing, darkness, and surprise. From Davis Island, the covered barges and the tugboat Little Bill would move toward Homestead with 300 Pinkerton agents inside. Their destination was the riverfront of the Carnegie steel plant. Their purpose was to secure the works for non-union labor. Their arrival would bring the private machinery of Gilded Age strike-breaking directly into a town already on alert. By then, the conflict had passed beyond wage scales and contract language. It had become a contest over access, authority, and force. And in the early hours of July 6, 1892, that contest began moving over the water. The movement over the water was meant to solve a problem that the fences and locked gates had not solved by themselves. Carnegie Steel could claim the Homestead Works as company property. Henry Clay Frick could fortify the plant and prepare to restart production with replacement labor. But the company still needed bodies inside the works, men who could hold the grounds and make the reopening possible. With the land approaches blocked by workers and townspeople, the river became the chosen route. That choice was practical. It was also dangerous. The Pinkerton force did not march openly down the roads into Homestead. It did not arrive by train in broad daylight, under the watch of a community already organized against the company's plans. According to the account preserved by Rivers of Steel, the movement began from Davis Island on the Ohio River. From there, the Pinkerton agents traveled in covered barges, towed by the tugboat Little Bill. Their destination was the riverfront near the Homestead Mill. Their timing placed them in the early morning darkness of July 6, 1892. The details matter because they show the character of the operation. This was not simply transportation. It was an attempt to use geography as strategy. The Monongahela and Ohio rivers were part of the industrial world around Pittsburgh. They carried raw materials, finished products, workers, and machinery. In this case, they carried armed private agents toward a labor conflict that had already transformed the town. The barges were covered, which meant the men inside were partly concealed from view. The tugboat Little Bill provided the power, pulling the barges toward the mill landing. The plan depended on reaching company property from the water before the opposing side could stop them. If it worked, the Pinkertons could disembark near the works, enter the fortified plant, and help secure it for non-union labor. Once inside, their position would be different. They would not be trying to force a gate from the outside. They would be holding ground within the company's own enclosure. From the standpoint of the company's plan, the logic was clear. The workers had made land access difficult. The mill sat along the river. The river offered a way around local control of roads, gates, and streets. A stealthy arrival in the early morning could put the Pinkertons where Frick needed them before the town could fully respond. But the same logic revealed the risk. A force of about 300 armed agents was being sent into a place where thousands of workers and supporters had been watching the company's movements for days. Homestead was not asleep in any political sense. It had been mobilized by the lockout, by the fortification of the mill, and by the expectation that Carnegie Steel would try to bring in outside labor under guard. The company looked at the river and saw a route of entry. Workers looked at the same river and understood that it might become the route by which their exclusion was enforced. In the darkness, the operation carried two meanings at once. To Frick and the company, it was a way to reassert control without fighting through blocked land approaches. To the men and families of Homestead, it could only appear as an armed descent on the town's central workplace. The Pinkertons were not neutral officers of public law. They belonged to a private detective agency hired by the company. In Gilded Age labor disputes, that distinction was central. Private security forces could act with the appearance of police authority, but their immediate obligation was to the employer who hired them. That fact shaped the atmosphere before a shot was fired. The locked-out workers did not see the barges as a public peacekeeping mission. They saw them as an instrument of strike-breaking. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency already carried a reputation in American labor conflict. Its agents had been hired not to mediate a settlement, but to secure access and protect the company's plan to restart production with non-union labor. Their arrival meant that the lockout was entering a new phase. The dispute was no longer only about who would sign a contract or what wage scale would apply. It was about who could occupy the mill. The terrain made the confrontation more compressed. Homestead Works stood on the Monongahela River, close to the town whose life was tied to the plant. The riverfront was not an empty frontier. It was part of an industrial landscape where the mill, the water, and the surrounding community were tightly connected. Any attempt to land there would be visible, contested, and symbolically charged. The plant was the object of the dispute. The shore was the line between the company's tactical plan and the workers' claim that they still had a collective stake in the works. The Little Bill's movement through the dark also shows how far the conflict had traveled from ordinary negotiation. Earlier, the argument had centered on wage reductions and the future of collective bargaining. Then came the breakdown of talks, the lockout, and the transformation of the mill into what workers called Fort Frick. Each step narrowed the room for compromise. By the time the tugboat was towing the covered barges toward Homestead, the company was not asking the locked-out men to accept terms across a bargaining table. It was preparing to bring an armed private force into the plant. There was a tactical confidence in that plan, but also a misreading. The company understood that workers had blocked the roads. It understood that the mill needed to be physically secured. It understood that the river could bypass the town's control of land approaches. What the plan underestimated was the danger of treating Homestead as a space that could be entered by surprise, without consequence. The people on shore were not a passive crowd. They were workers, families, and townspeople already alerted by the company's preparations. They had watched the fence rise. They had seen the plant turned inward against them. They knew that replacement labor could break not only a strike, but the power of the union inside the steel industry. The men in the barges also moved toward danger. They were armed, but they were enclosed in floating structures being brought to a hostile landing. If the operation failed, the river that had been chosen as a pathway could become a trap. The covered barges offered concealment on the approach, but once their presence was known, they limited movement. The Pinkertons could not simply disappear into the streets or take control of the town by arriving at the water's edge. They had to land, form, and secure a position under the eyes of a community prepared to resist them. This was the fragile center of the plan. It needed surprise, but it was moving into a place where surprise was difficult to preserve. The lockout had already put Homestead on watch. The meaning of the Pinkertons' arrival was not obscure. A private force entering the mill before dawn could only intensify the belief that the company intended to impose its authority by force. In the early morning of July 6, 1892, the tugboat Little Bill drew the barges toward the Homestead riverfront. Inside were about 300 Pinkerton agents. Around the mill was a town that had been pushed from negotiation into defense. Between them lay the river landing, the narrow point where company strategy and worker resistance would meet. The plan had been built around darkness. It had been built around the hope that the river would allow armed men to enter company property without fighting their way through Homestead streets. But darkness could not remove the larger reality. The mill was fortified. The workers were mobilized. The Pinkertons were armed. And as the barges neared the works, the central uncertainty of the day began to take shape. Not whether confrontation would come, but how it would begin, and whose account of that beginning would be believed. As the barges came in toward the Homestead works, the plan that had seemed tactical from a distance became intensely human at the river's edge. The Little Bill had brought about 300 Pinkerton agents through the dark, but the last stage of the movement could not remain hidden. Men had to step from boat to shore. Lines had to be secured. A landing had to be made at a place already watched by workers and townspeople who believed the company was trying to take back the mill by force. That is where the archive becomes most difficult. The beginning of the battle at Homestead is often told as if it turns on a single sharp sound, the first shot. But that sound cannot be recovered with certainty. No reliable source can definitively establish which side fired first. What survives are accounts shaped by fear, allegiance, legal risk, newspaper interpretation, and the wider struggle to define what had happened. To Carnegie Steel and its defenders, the Pinkertons could be described as men sent to protect company property and restore order. To the locked-out workers and their supporters, the agents were an armed private force brought secretly by river to break the strike and open the way for non-union labor. Each side had reason to place the first act of violence in the hands of the other. The uncertainty matters because the first shot was never only a ballistic question. It became a moral question. Who began the violence? Who was defending? Who was invading? Who could claim law and who could be labeled a mob? On the morning of July 6, 1892, those questions did not appear in clean legal language. They appeared in darkness, noise, and movement near the landing. The Pinkertons were trying to enter the works from the Monongahela River. The workers and townspeople on shore were trying to stop them. The company's strategy depended on gaining physical control of the plant. The workers' strategy depended on preventing that control from being established. Once the barges reached the riverfront, there was no neutral space left between those objectives. The geography compressed the confrontation. Homestead Works stood along the river, with the mill grounds behind the landing and the town close enough for alarm to spread quickly. The plant had already been transformed into what workers called Fort Frick, a fortified industrial enclosure rather than an ordinary workplace. Land approaches had been blocked by the workers, which is why the river route had become important in the first place. The Little Bill and its covered barges were not simply transportation. They were an attempt to bypass local control of the streets and gates. But the river did not bypass the town's attention. As the Pinkertons attempted to land, workers and townspeople gathered on shore. The exact sequence of those first moments remains contested, but the broad outline is clear. An armed force hired by Henry Clay Frick came to the mill by barge. A mobilized community met it at the water. The agents did not enter quietly and take possession. Instead, the landing attempt triggered armed confrontation almost immediately. In later accounts, the first shot could be made to carry the whole meaning of the strike. If the Pinkertons fired first, then the locked-out workers could be presented as resisting an armed incursion into their town and workplace. If the workers fired first, then the company and its allies could present the strikers as violent men attacking agents who had arrived to protect property. The facts around the first shot were uncertain, but the uses of that uncertainty were very clear. This is a recurring problem in the history of labor violence. Industrial conflict often produced records, but not always clarity. Company statements, union accounts, court testimony, newspaper reports, and later commemorations could preserve details while also framing them. Violence at a strike was rarely described in neutral terms. It was translated into claims about legitimacy. A crowd could be called citizens, strikers, workers, rioters, or a mob. Armed agents could be called guards, detectives, deputies, strikebreakers, or invaders. The word chosen often told the listener what conclusion to reach before the evidence had been weighed. At Homestead, that struggle over language began at the same time as the gunfire. The Pinkertons were not arriving as ordinary employees. They were agents of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a private institution already associated with industrial disputes across the United States. Their role sat uneasily between private employment and public authority. They were not the state militia. They were not a municipal police force under ordinary local control. Yet they had been hired to perform a function that looked very much like coercive public power, to secure a major industrial plant against a locked-out workforce and make it possible for the company to resume operations with replacement labor. For workers on shore, this distinction was not abstract. If the Pinkertons succeeded in landing, they could help shift control of the works back to Carnegie Steel. Once inside, they could protect the plant, protect non-union workers, and make the lockout harder to resist. The landing itself was therefore not a minor movement of men from boat to shore. It was the critical transfer of force into the disputed space. For the Pinkertons inside the barges, the scene must also have been threatening. They had been sent into a town already mobilized against them. They were confined in vessels near a hostile shore, facing men who knew the ground, knew the mill, and understood what their arrival meant. Even if the operation had been planned as a controlled landing, the reality was unstable from the moment the barges were seen and challenged. Then came gunfire. The record does not allow us to say, with confidence, whose weapon produced the first shot. What can be said is that once shooting began, the possibility of a simple landing disappeared. The attempted entry became a battle between the agents on or near the barges and workers and townspeople on shore. The confrontation had crossed a threshold. What had been a struggle over contract terms, wage reductions, collective bargaining, and property access was now a fight in which men could be killed. This is one reason the first shot remained so powerful in memory. It marks the moment when institutions became bodies. Carnegie Steel was not an abstract corporation at the river landing. It was represented by armed men trying to come ashore. The Amalgamated Association and its supporters were not only a negotiating force, they were part of a crowd determined to hold the line at the works. Frick's strategy, planned through contracts and security arrangements, met the lived resistance of a town whose economy and identity were tied to the mill. The uncertainty also reminds us to be careful with hindsight. The battle at Homestead can appear inevitable because we know what followed. We know the day became one of the most famous violent labor confrontations in United States history. We know casualties were reported. We know the Pinkertons would eventually surrender. We know the conflict would draw in the state militia and reshape the public narrative of the strike. But at the river's edge in the early morning, the participants did not yet know the full course of the day. They knew only that the company had sent armed men and that those men were trying to land. From that point forward, every action was interpreted through suspicion. A movement on the barge could be seen as preparation to attack. A movement on shore could be seen as an assault. A warning could be heard as a threat. A shot, once fired, could produce answering fire before anyone could establish where it had begun. That is the tragedy of the unresolved first shot. It does not mean that nothing can be known. The central facts remain firm. The Pinkertons came by river on July 6, 1892. They attempted to land near the Homestead Works. Workers and townspeople resisted. Armed confrontation followed. But the missing certainty at the beginning prevents the story from being reduced to a single clean verdict about the first instant of violence. Instead, it forces us to see Homestead as a conflict in which power and narrative moved together. The company had power in capital, property, management, and private security. The workers had power in organization, local solidarity, and physical control of the approaches to the mill. Both sides also fought to define the meaning of the confrontation. The first shot became evidence, symbol, accusation, and defense all at once. By sunrise, the question of who fired first was already being overtaken by the scale of what followed. The landing had failed to produce a quick occupation of the works. The Pinkertons were not securely inside the plant. The workers and townspeople had not been dispersed. The barges remained a focus of danger along the riverfront, and the armed standoff was expanding into a day-long fight. The uncertainty at the start did not slow the violence. It became part of it. Once the first shot was absorbed into competing stories, the battle continued in the open, with rifles, barricades, improvised tactics, and a town drawn deeper into conflict. The question of the beginning would remain disputed. The consequences would be much harder to deny. By the time the first exchange of fire had become impossible to untangle, the fight at Homestead had entered a different phase. It was no longer only a failed landing or a dispute over whether armed private guards had been attacked or had opened fire. It was now a sustained battle along the Monongahela River, with the Carnegie steelworks behind its fences, the barges at the water's edge, and the town gathering around the sound of rifles. The Battle of July 6, 1892, lasted roughly 12 hours. That duration matters. A brief clash could be described as panic, mistake, or sudden outrage. 12 hours made the confrontation something larger and more revealing. It showed how thoroughly the conflict had been prepared on both sides, even if not in the same way. Carnegie Steel had prepared with fences, private guards, and a river operation. The workers and townspeople prepared through local organization, watchfulness, and a willingness to defend control of the mill district with whatever means they could find. The Pinkertons, according to PBS's account, were armed with Winchester rifles. In the context of the riverfront, that detail is not incidental. These were not ordinary watchmen arriving with badges and nightsticks. They were private agents sent in force, carrying firearms, and brought by barge to a town already convinced that the company meant to break the union and reopen the works on non-union terms. Once the shooting began, the Pinkertons' position inside or near the barges gave them cover, but it also trapped them. The same river route that had been meant to let them bypass the blocked land approaches now limited their movement. They had reached Homestead, but they had not secured it. From shore, workers and townspeople returned fire. The exact lines of the battlefield were not formal military lines. This was an industrial landscape turned into a combat zone. The riverbank, mill approaches, structures near the works, and improvised positions all became part of the fight. Earlier, Frick's fortified plant had turned the workplace into what workers called Fort Frick. On July 6th, the area outside that fortification became just as important. Control of the riverfront was control over whether the Pinkertons could land, spread out, and perform the task they had been hired to do. The workers' tactics were improvised because their situation was improvised. They were not a state force. They were not a company security force. They were locked-out steelworkers, union men and non-union supporters, joined by townspeople who understood the mill not as an abstraction, but as the center of Homestead's life. Their defense used what the setting offered. Accounts describe gunfire from shore, barricades, and attempts to burn or sink the barges. Multiple accounts also refer to at least one cannon being used against the Pinkertons' position. The cannon has become one of the more vivid details in later descriptions of the battle, partly because it captures the strange mixture of desperation, theatricality, and danger that marked the day. It was not a neat military engagement. It was an industrial town trying to repel a private armed force with tools at hand, with weapons that ranged from rifles to improvised devices to heavier firepower when it could be brought into use. The image is dramatic, but its meaning is practical. The barges had to be made untenable. If the Pinkertons could not be dislodged by rifle fire alone, then burning them out, sinking them, or battering them from shore became part of the local strategy. The barges themselves were central to the violence. They had carried the Pinkertons from Davis Island on the Ohio River, towed by the Little Bill, toward the Monongahela riverfront of the Homestead Works. During the battle, they became both shelter and target. Their covered structure protected the agents from some of the fire coming from shore, but that same enclosure made them vulnerable to attack by fire. Attempts to burn or sink the barges were not merely acts of fury. They were tactical efforts to end the standoff by destroying the Pinkertons' place of refuge. For the workers and townspeople, there was another logic at work as well. If the Pinkertons succeeded in landing and holding the works, then Carnegie Steel could move closer to reopening the plant under company control, with replacement labor protected inside the fortified grounds. If the Pinkertons failed, then the locked-out workers could preserve their control over access to the mill, at least for the moment. Every hour that the agents remained contained near the river was an hour in which the company's plan had not fully succeeded. But the cost of that resistance rose through the day. Rifle fire does not remain symbolic for long. The casualties at Homestead became part of the historical record, and also part of the memory of the strike. Multiple sources report that 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons were killed. Some sources phrase the toll as at least 3 Pinkertons and 7 workers killed during the battle and aftermath. The difference in phrasing is important because the violence did not end cleanly when the shooting stopped. The battle, the surrender, and the treatment of the surrendered men would blur the boundary between combat and aftermath. Still, the scale of the loss on July 6th is clear enough. Men on both sides died in a conflict that had begun as a struggle over wages, contracts, and authority inside a steel mill. The dead workers were part of a community defending what it believed was its right to bargain and to prevent the plant from being taken over by armed strikebreakers. The dead Pinkertons were agents of a private detective agency hired to carry out a company plan in a dispute that public law had not resolved. Their deaths show how quickly private policing could turn a labor conflict into a lethal armed encounter. That is one of the central facts of Homestead. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency operated in a space between private employment and public force. Its agents were not the state militia. They were not neutral peacekeepers. They were hired by the company to secure company property and make possible the arrival of non-union labor. Yet they arrived armed, organized, and in a body large enough to resemble a military detachment. When they met armed resistance from workers and townspeople, the result was not policing in any ordinary sense. It was battle. The long duration of the fight also changed the meaning of the town's participation. As the hours passed, the confrontation was not confined to the first men at the riverbank. Homestead itself was drawn deeper in. The sound of firing, the effort to hold the riverfront, the attempts to destroy the barges, and the spread of barricades made the conflict visible to the community as a whole. This was one reason the strike became so powerful in public memory. It was not hidden inside a workplace. It unfolded in open view at the edge of the mill and the town, where industrial power met local resistance. The day also exposed the limits of both plans. Frick's plan depended on the Pinkertons entering the works and securing it for replacement labor. The river approach had been chosen because land access was blocked, but the river did not deliver secrecy or control. The workers' plan, if it can be called a plan, depended on preventing that landing and keeping the agents pinned down. They succeeded in stopping a quick occupation, but they did so through violence that would later be judged not only by those who supported them, but also by newspapers, officials, and a national public trying to decide what Homestead meant. By late in the day, the Pinkertons' position had become increasingly untenable. They had not taken command of the works. They had endured hours of fire from shore, and the barges that carried them had become a dangerous enclosure rather than a secure base. The workers and townspeople, for all their losses, still held the advantage of place. They knew the town, controlled the approaches, and had surrounded the agents not as individuals, but as symbols of the company's attempt to break local power. The battle's end would not bring calm. Surrender would resolve the immediate armed standoff, but it would open another chapter in the struggle over public meaning. The same crowd that had fought the Pinkertons through the day would soon confront them as defeated men. What happened after the guns fell silent would travel beyond Homestead as quickly as news of the battle itself, shaping sympathy, blame, and the way the country understood the violence on the Monongahela. When the firing stopped, the meaning of the day was still unsettled. The Pinkertons had failed to take the Homestead works. The workers and townspeople still held the ground around the mill and the riverfront. But the end of the battle did not end the violence, and it did not settle the question of who would be seen as victim, aggressor, or defender. The surrender of the Pinkerton agents should have been the moment when the immediate danger narrowed. The armed men on the barges had been trapped for hours along the Monongahela River. Their attempt to land near the works had become a public defeat. They had not secured the plant for Carnegie steel. They had not opened the way for replacement labor. They had instead become surrounded, exposed, and cut off inside the very plan that was supposed to give the company control. But surrender at Homestead took place inside a town already transformed by fear, grief, and anger. 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons were reported killed in the day's violence, with some accounts phrasing the toll as at least 3 Pinkertons and 7 workers killed during the battle and its aftermath. Those numbers were not abstract to the crowd on the riverbank. They belonged to men who had fought, fallen, and been carried from a conflict that many in Homestead understood as an invasion of their workplace and their community. The Pinkertons were not entering public memory as neutral guards. They had been hired by Henry Clay Frick to help secure the Carnegie steel plant for non-union labor. They had arrived by river in covered barges towed by the tugboat Little Bill after land approaches had been blocked. They were armed, and their presence embodied the company's decision to use private force in a labor dispute. To the workers and townspeople, the agents were not simply defeated opponents. They were the visible edge of a larger corporate strategy. That is why the surrender was so dangerous. The Pinkertons had laid down their position, but they had not escaped what they represented. After the agents surrendered, they were marched through town. During that march, they were assaulted. The research record is direct on this point. Surrendered Pinkertons were attacked as they were moved through Homestead. This was not the organized gun battle of the riverfront. It was a different kind of violence, one that unfolded after the immediate military purpose had passed. The agents were no longer trying to force a landing. They were no longer in control of the barges. They were prisoners, or at least defeated men under escort, moving through a hostile crowd. The distinction mattered enormously. For many hours, the strikers and their supporters could present themselves as defending the town against armed private agents brought in under cover of darkness. The company had fortified the works. Frick had locked out or fired thousands of workers, depending on the source's phrasing. The Pinkertons had been hired to enter the plant by force and help break local control. In that frame, Homestead's resistance could be understood as a defense against corporate power and private policing. But the treatment of surrendered men complicated that frame. Assaults on the Pinkertons after surrender gave management a powerful public argument. Carnegie Steel could now point not only to the battle itself, where responsibility for the first shot remained disputed, but to the visible abuse of men who had already yielded. The company could describe the Union and its supporters as violent and disorderly. It could shift attention away from the decision to hire armed Pinkertons and toward the conduct of the crowd after the fighting ended. This is one of the central turns in the Homestead story. Public sympathy did not move according to one fact alone. It moved through images, reports, and moral judgments. A company bringing armed private agents by barge could appear ruthless. A crowd beating surrendered agents could appear lawless. Both things could be true in the public mind, but the second could weaken the force of the first. The surrendered Pinkertons were taken to the Homestead Opera House. That detail matters because it shows how fully the town itself had become part of the conflict. The battle had begun at the river landing near the works, but its aftermath moved through civic space. A building associated with public gathering and performance became, for a time, a holding place for defeated private guards. The industrial dispute had spilled from the mill to the river, from the river into the streets, and from the streets into one of the town's public interiors. From there, the agents were sent out of Homestead by rail. Their removal ended their immediate role in the confrontation, but it did not remove the damage done by their passage through town. The march, the assaults, the opera house, and the rail departure became part of the record that traveled beyond the Monongahela Valley. The Pinkertons had failed tactically, but the aftermath of their surrender helped Carnegie Steel recover politically. For the strikers, this was a bitter reversal. They had withstood one of the most dramatic private security operations in American labor history. They had prevented 300 armed Pinkerton agents from taking possession of the works. They had shown that Homestead was not only a company town or a collection of mill hands waiting for orders. It was a mobilized community with the ability to resist. Yet at the very moment when that resistance might have won wider sympathy, the violence against surrendered men gave critics a simpler story to tell. That simpler story did not require the public to understand wage scales, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, or the company's effort to change the balance of power inside the mill. It did not require close attention to the union contract that had expired at the end of June or on July 1st, depending on source phrasing. It did not require weighing Andrew Carnegie's absence in Scotland against Frick's command on the ground. It required only the image of a crowd attacking defeated agents. In conflicts over labor and power, the aftermath often shapes memory as strongly as the original cause. Homestead had begun as a struggle over wages, collective bargaining, and control of production. But the events after surrender helped turn the public conversation toward order, violence, and authority. Management could present itself as the party seeking to restore lawful control of property. The union could be cast as unable to restrain its own supporters. That portrayal was damaging, even though the Pinkertons had been brought to Homestead as part of a plan to force the issue. The fact that the Pinkertons were private agents also became blurred in the public argument. They were not the state militia. They were not local police acting under a public chain of command. They belonged to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a private institution that had become deeply associated with Gilded Age labor disputes. But once the agents surrendered and were assaulted, their private role could be overshadowed by their vulnerability. They could be presented less as instruments of company power and more as men abused after defeat. This did not erase the anger in Homestead. For workers and townspeople, the company had locked them out, fortified the plant, and tried to bring in armed men from the river. The works were not merely a site of employment. They were the center of the town's economic life and of a skilled labor culture that had claimed a voice inside production. The Pinkertons' arrival had felt like an attempt to break that voice. But public sympathy is rarely governed by the full structure of a conflict. It often turns on moments that appear morally legible from a distance. The surrender therefore became a hinge. On one side was the failed private invasion of the mill. On the other was the argument that Homestead had fallen into mob rule. Carnegie Steel needed that second argument. Frick's plan to use Pinkertons had produced deaths, national attention, and a humiliating defeat on the river. But the assaults after surrender allowed management to recover part of the narrative. The company could now claim that stronger public authority was necessary, not only to protect the works, but to restore order in the town. That claim would soon matter on the ground. The workers had defeated the Pinkertons, but they had not defeated the company. The plant still stood behind its fences. Carnegie Steel still intended to restart production with replacement labor. Frick remained in command of the company's response. And outside Homestead, officials now had to decide whether the conflict was a local labor dispute, a private corporate failure, or a breakdown of public order requiring state intervention. The march through town made that decision easier to justify. The same violence that expressed the rage of Homestead's residents weakened their political position. It gave opponents of the strike a way to separate the workers from the language of defense and attach them instead to the language of disorder. By the time the Pinkertons left by rail, the immediate battlefield had changed. The barges no longer held the central force. The question was no longer whether private guards could enter the works from the river. That effort had failed. The question now was who would come after them, and under whose authority. Homestead had proven that a mobilized town could repel a private army. But it had also shown that such a victory could carry its own costs. The violence after surrender narrowed the space for sympathy and widened the path for outside power. Soon, the force that entered Homestead would not be Pinkerton agents hired by Carnegie Steel. It would be public military authority sent by Pennsylvania's governor to take control where private force had failed. The departure of the Pinkertons did not restore local control for long. It created a vacancy. For several days, Homestead had shown that armed private force could be resisted, even defeated, when it entered a working-class town under cover of corporate authority. But after the surrender, and after the assaults on the disarmed men as they were marched through town, the public meaning of that victory changed. The question facing Pennsylvania officials was no longer only what Carnegie Steel had done, or what the Amalgamated Association had defended. It was whether Homestead would remain under the practical control of strikers and townspeople, or whether the state would impose order on behalf of public authority. That decision belonged to Pennsylvania Governor Robert Emory Pattison. Pattison had to act in a moment when the language around the strike had shifted. The first phase of the Homestead crisis had been about a workplace and a contract. Henry Clay Frick had moved to reduce wages and end collective bargaining with the Amalgamated Association at the Homestead Works. The company had fortified the plant, locked out workers, and attempted to bring in armed Pinkerton agents by river. But after July 6, 1892, the conflict had become something larger in the eyes of the state. A steel town had been armed. A private force had been beaten back. Men had been killed. Surrendered guards had been attacked in the streets. The company still did not have secure control of its own mill, and the strikers still held the local advantage. The governor's response was to send state militia, often described in accounts as National Guard forces, to Homestead. Their arrival marked a decisive change. The company's first attempt to retake the works had depended on private armed men brought in through the Monongahela River. That attempt had failed at the landing. The new force came not as Pinkerton detectives, not as hired guards, and not as company employees. It came under the authority of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. On July 12th, the plant was turned over to them. That date matters because it marks the transfer from one kind of power to another. The Pinkertons had represented private coercion in an industrial dispute. They had been hired by Frick to secure company property and make it possible to bring in non-union labor. Their defeat had seemed, for a brief moment, to prove that a mobilized town could prevent Carnegie Steel from reopening the works on the company's terms. But the arrival of the militia changed the ground beneath that conclusion. The state did not need to win the same fight the Pinkertons had lost. It did not need to slip in by barge before dawn or force a landing under gunfire. It arrived with public military legitimacy and with the power to occupy space. The militia established a camp overlooking Homestead. From that position, its presence could be felt both in the town and at the mill. This was not only a defensive arrangement. It was a visible statement about who now held authority over the contested landscape. In earlier days, geography had favored the strikers. The town stood close to the works. The riverfront gave residents warning and access. Roads and approaches could be watched. The plant gates and land routes could be obstructed. The Pinkerton Plan had tried to bypass that local control by using the Monongahela as an entrance. The militia's camp reversed the relationship. It looked down on the place where the struggle had been, local, intimate, and street level. It guarded both the town and the mill, binding them together as a single security problem. The Homestead Works was no longer only a workplace surrounded by a strike. Homestead itself was now a zone under armed public supervision. This was the moment when Carnegie Steel began to regain what it had lost on July 6th. The company had not won the battle at the river. Its hired force had surrendered. Its plan to use the Pinkertons to open the works had become a national scandal. But state intervention gave the company something even more useful than a private victory, a protected environment in which management could reassert control. That distinction is important. The militia did not arrive as a bargaining committee. It did not resolve the wage dispute. It did not restore the Amalgamated Association's position inside the mill. Its function was order, and in practice, order meant that the company could move again. Once public military power controlled access, guarded the plant, and limited the strikers' ability to govern the ground around the works, the balance changed. The strike still existed, but it no longer controlled the decisive space. For the men of the Amalgamated Association and the thousands of non-union workers who had supported them, this was a serious reversal. Their strength had come partly from numbers, partly from organization, and partly from the fact that Homestead was their town. They knew the approaches to the works. They knew the riverfront. They knew the streets through which the surrendered Pinkertons had been marched to the Homestead Opera House before being sent away by rail. Local knowledge and local solidarity had mattered. But against the militia, those advantages became harder to use. The arrival of state troops also changed the moral argument. Before July 6th, Frick's decision to hire 300 armed Pinkerton agents could be portrayed as an aggressive act, an attempt to force open the works against a locked-out workforce. After the day-long battle, the deaths, and the mistreatment of surrendered men, opponents of the strike had a new frame. They could argue that Homestead was not simply a labor dispute, but a disorder requiring state control. That did not erase the company's role in creating the crisis. It did not erase the fortification of the plant, the lockout, or the river operation. But it did make it easier for state power to enter without appearing merely as an extension of Carnegie Steel. In practice, however, the effect favored the company. The militia guarded the mill. The militia guarded the town. The company could prepare to restart operations under protection that the Pinkertons had failed to provide. The armed occupation did not have to declare itself anti-union in order to weaken the union's position. It only had to make the plant accessible to management and replacement labor. This is one of the central patterns of the Homestead Strike. Private force failed in a dramatic and bloody way, but that failure opened the path for public force. The Pinkertons had exposed the danger of allowing corporations to bring quasi-police armies into labor disputes. Yet when the state took over the ground, the result was not a restoration of worker power. It was the stabilization of company property and the reduction of the strikers' practical control. For Homestead residents, the change must have been visible in every direction. The riverfront where the barges had been fought over was no longer the central point of command. The fortified works, once mocked as Fort Frick and surrounded by a hostile town, stood under state guard. The camp overlooking Homestead made the occupation part of the daily landscape. The town that had gathered in defense of the strike was now watched by soldiers. The symbolism was stark. Carnegie Steel had tried to turn the mill into a fortress before the battle. After July 12th, the state helped make that fortress usable. Governor Patterson's decision did not end the strike immediately. It did not produce a sudden settlement or a quiet return to normal work. But it marked the beginning of a new phase in which time worked against the Amalgamated Association. Every day, the plant remained under guard. The company had a better chance to restart production. Every movement of replacement workers into the protected works would test the strike's ability to continue. The union's original leverage had come from stopping production and preventing Carnegie Steel from operating without its skilled men. State protection began to undermine that leverage at the point where it mattered most. By mid-July, the Homestead Works would be operating again with replacement workers. That was the consequence toward which the militia's occupation pointed. The defeated Pinkertons had left by rail, but the company's larger campaign had not ended with their failure. It resumed under a different shield. The scene had moved from barges and gunfire to camps, guards, and controlled access. The struggle was still about wages, bargaining, and authority inside the steelworks, but the terrain had changed. Homestead was no longer held by the crowd that had repelled the Pinkertons. It was held under the eye of the state, and behind that line, Carnegie Steel began to rebuild its power. Under the eye of the state, Carnegie Steel could do what it had not been able to do while the riverfront and the gates were held by the strikers. It could begin the practical work of restarting the Homestead Works. The change was not only military, it was operational. The plant that had been fortified, attacked, defended, and occupied now became again what Henry Clay Frick needed it to be, a workplace under company control, guarded strongly enough to bring in men willing to work under the company's terms. By mid-July 1892, the mill was operating again with replacement workers. That fact marked a turning point in the strike. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had drawn its power from interruption. Its strength rested on the ability to stop production, to keep skilled labor out of the works, and to prevent Carnegie Steel from proving that the plant could run without the men who had built their authority inside it. The Union and its supporters had defeated the Pinkertons on July 6th, but the arrival of Pennsylvania militia forces shifted the question from who could win a battle at the landing to who could sustain control over time. The company did not need to win back public affection in Homestead in order to restart production. It needed secure access. It needed protection from men entering the mill. It needed the state's presence to reduce the power of local resistance. Once the militia guarded both the town and the works, the company had a shield that the Pinkerton barges had failed to provide. Replacement workers changed the strike from within. They were not merely a workforce. They were evidence in motion of the company's larger claim that Carnegie Steel could operate without recognizing the union's authority. Each man brought into the works weakened the strikers' position. Each shift run inside the guarded plant made the lockout less like a temporary shutdown and more like a permanent reordering of power. For the union, the problem was immediate and severe. If the Homestead works could be restarted, then the company could wait. The strikers, by contrast, had to endure without wages while watching the place they had defended resume production without them. The battle had shown courage and organization, but industrial conflict was not decided only by courage. It was decided by access to property, by control over transportation routes, by the endurance of families, by the willingness of public authorities to protect one side's ability to operate, and by the ability to shape public meaning. That public meaning had already begun to move against the strikers after the assault on surrendered Pinkerton agents. The men from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency had arrived as armed agents hired by the company, and their attempt to enter by river had triggered a violent confrontation. Yet after their surrender, the spectacle of defeated men being assaulted while marched through town gave Carnegie Steel and its allies a powerful image. It allowed the company to argue that the union and its supporters represented disorder, even though the company had been the party to bring private armed force toward the mill. Then, on July 23, 1892, the strike suffered another blow to public sympathy, one that came from outside the union's command and outside its strategy. Alexander Berkman, an anarchist not connected to the Amalgamated Association, attempted to assassinate Henry Clay Frick. Berkman's act did not arise from the union's official leadership. It was not a union operation. It was not the planned action of the Homestead workers. That distinction mattered then, and it matters in any careful account of the strike. The Amalgamated Association had been engaged in a labor struggle over wages, collective bargaining, and control inside the mill. Berkman's politics and his act belonged to a different current of radical violence. But public reaction does not always preserve distinctions that history must preserve. To many observers, the attempted assassination confirmed the darkest claims being made about labor unrest. It connected, in the public imagination, the strike at Homestead with political violence beyond the union's control. Frick, who had ordered the fortification of the plant and had hired the Pinkertons, could now be seen by many not only as a hard industrial manager, but as the target of attempted murder. Sympathy that had been divided became easier to redirect. The company's argument that it faced violence and lawlessness became more persuasive to people who were not close enough to the Monongahela Valley to see the full sequence of cause and response. This was one of the cruel mechanics of the Homestead Strike. The union did not need to authorize every act for every act to damage it. In a conflict watched by newspapers, politicians, employers, and workers across the country, events became symbols. The Pinkerton surrender became a symbol. The militia camp overlooking Homestead became a symbol. Replacement workers entering the plant under guard became a symbol. Berkman's attack on Frick became another one, and it helped narrow the political space in which the strikers could present themselves as defenders of collective bargaining. Inside Homestead, the practical situation continued to worsen. The works were no longer silent. The company's plan, interrupted at the river, had resumed behind public protection. The union's hold on the plant had been broken not in a single moment, but through a sequence: the failed negotiations, the lockout, the fortification of the works, the Pinkerton attack, the arrival of militia, the movement of replacement workers, and the collapse of wider sympathy after acts of violence could be used against the strike. Replacement labor also altered the social atmosphere around the conflict. The strike had never been only a matter of formal union membership. Earlier, thousands of non-union workers had supported the action, making the struggle broader than the Amalgamated Association itself. But as the company brought in workers to keep the mill running, solidarity faced the pressure of time, hunger, fear, and division. Later replacement labor included African American workers, and the conflict took on racialized dimensions, including a violent confrontation in November of 1892. That detail belongs to the difficult social reality of strike breaking in the period. Employers could use divisions among workers, and communities under pressure could respond in ways shaped by racial hostility as well as labor anger. By November of 1892, the Amalgamated Association conceded defeat at Homestead. The concession ended the strike as a contest for control of the Homestead works. It did not erase the memory of July 6th. It did not make the Pinkerton landing less important or the militia occupation less consequential, but it confirmed the result that Carnegie Steel had sought from the beginning of the confrontation. The Union's authority inside the plant had been broken. The defeat was not simply a failed strike. It was a transfer of power. Before the conflict, skilled workers organized through the Amalgamated Association had claimed a meaningful role in determining conditions inside the mill. After the defeat, Carnegie Steel had shown that it could lock out workers, survive a violent confrontation, call upon state protection, bring in replacement labor, and continue production without conceding to the union's central demand for recognition and bargaining power. That result reached far beyond one Pennsylvania town. Homestead became a warning to workers in heavy industry and a model of resolve for employers determined to resist union authority. The battle had been dramatic, but the quieter ending was just as important. Production resumed, men were replaced, public sympathy was weakened, and the union yielded. By the time the Amalgamated Association conceded, the physical landscape of Homestead still carried the traces of the struggle. The river route where the barges had come in, the mill grounds that had been fortified, the town that had watched armed force give way to public occupation, and the institutions that had tried to speak for labor under enormous pressure. But the larger consequence was not confined to those places. The broken strike became part of the structure of American steel itself, shaping how power would operate in the industry for decades. The final meaning of Homestead would be measured not only by the men killed in July or by the surrender in November, but by the long years in which steel unionism would struggle to return. The defeat at Homestead did not end when the Amalgamated Association conceded in November of 1892. It settled into the industry more slowly in hiring decisions, in bargaining rooms that no longer opened to the same union power, and in the daily knowledge that the largest steel companies had learned something from the conflict. They had learned that a determined corporation, supported by replacement labor, private security, and then public authority, could survive even a spectacular local uprising. For the workers who had held Homestead through the first days of July, the result was bitter. They had driven back the Pinkertons. They had shown that a mill town could mobilize with extraordinary speed, that skilled workers and thousands of supporters could close ranks around a workplace they believed they had helped build. But the final outcome did not belong to the first day of battle. It belonged to the longer contest that followed: the arrival of state militia, the reopening of the mill, the use of replacement workers, the collapse of public sympathy after further violence, and the slow exhaustion of the strike. In that longer contest, Carnegie Steel prevailed. The consequence reached far beyond the Monongahela River front. Homestead became a warning inside the steel industry. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had entered the conflict as one of the most important labor organizations in American heavy industry, especially among skilled iron and steel workers. After Homestead, its influence in steel was sharply reduced. The defeat did not merely break one strike. It helped open a long period in which effective union power in steel remained weak, fragmented, or excluded from the central mills where corporate authority was strongest. That is one reason the Homestead Strike occupies such a severe place in labor history. It was not simply a battle that workers lost. It was a defeat that helped shape the rules of industrial life for decades. The issue at the center of the struggle had always been larger than a wage scale. Wages mattered, and the proposed reductions helped bring the conflict to the edge. But by the summer of 1892, the deeper question was whether organized skilled workers could continue to bargain collectively with Carnegie Steel, or whether management would decide the terms of work without that shared authority. Homestead tested that question under extreme pressure. The answer, in the immediate aftermath, favored the company. The mill could be fortified. Access could be controlled. Replacement workers could be brought in. Public military authority could secure the ground after private force had failed. And once production resumed, the union's ability to hold the works declined. This pattern was not unique to Homestead, but Homestead made it visible with unusual clarity. In the Gilded Age industrial order, property rights, corporate organization, private policing, and state power could converge around the protection of production. Workers had numbers, skill, neighborhood solidarity, and moral claims. Companies had capital, legal ownership, managerial command, and access to coercive force. The confrontation on the Monongahela exposed the imbalance between those forms of power. The Pinkerton barges made that imbalance dramatic. The militia camp made it durable. Rivers of Steel places the return of successful steel unionism much later, with the Steel Workers Organizing Committee in the late 1930s. That distance matters. It means that Homestead was not followed quickly by recovery. It took roughly a generation and more for steelworkers to regain a successful organizing foothold on the scale needed to challenge the industry again. Between the surrender in 1892 and the organizing drives of the late 1930s lay decades in which the memory of Homestead remained powerful, but the practical strength of unionism in steel remained deeply constrained. In that sense, Homestead became both a lesson and a wound. For employers, it showed that militant resistance could be overcome if the company endured the first shock and regained control of the plant. For workers, it showed the courage and limits of local solidarity when arrayed against corporate and state power. For the public, it became a story that could be told in competing ways, as an account of law and order restored, as a tragedy of labor repression, as a warning about private armies, or as evidence of the dangers of industrial violence. The archive does not reduce it to one simple moral. It preserves the difficulty. There were armed Pinkerton agents moving by river toward a town already on edge. There were workers and townspeople who saw that arrival as an invasion. There was gunfire whose first shot cannot be definitively assigned. There were deaths on both sides. There was the surrender of the Pinkertons and then assaults on disarmed men that damaged sympathy for the strikers. There was a governor's decision to send public force. There was a mill restarted with replacement workers. There was Alexander Berkman's attack on Henry Clay Frick, carried out by an anarchist not connected to the Union, which further weakened support for the strike. There was, finally, a concession. All of those facts belong together. To separate them too neatly is to lose the shape of the event. The places that remain help hold that complexity. In Homestead and nearby Monongahela, the story is not only a set of dates in a labor history timeline. It is tied to surviving ground, buildings, riverbanks, and industrial remains. The pump house area at 880 East Waterfront Drive in Monongahela stands near the landscape where the river landing and battle are remembered. The Homestead Works pump house dates to 1892, the same year as the strike, and now helps interpret the Battle of Homestead. It gives the story a physical scale, the river close by, the former industrial ground around it, the sense of how little distance separated workplace, water, and town. The Bost Building at 623 East 8th Avenue in Homestead preserves another part of the geography. Built in 1892 as a hotel for Homestead's growing worker ward, it served as headquarters for the Amalgamated Association during the strike. It is now a National Historic Landmark used by Rivers of Steel. If the pump house points toward confrontation at the river, the Bost Building points toward organization, communication, and the effort to direct a strike under intense pressure. Together, they mark two kinds of power: the power of people gathered around a union cause, and the power of events that can overrun even the most organized plans. Other memorial landscapes widen the frame. The Homestead Labyrinth, created in 2009 by Rivers of Steel, spans 68 feet and includes more than 250 triangular stones memorializing regional steel sites. It is not a reconstruction of the battle. It is a way of walking through memory, one stone at a time, through a region where steel shapes towns, families, work rhythms, injuries, migrations, and political struggle. Across the Monongahela from the pump house area, the Carey blast furnaces stand as part of the broader Rivers of Steel heritage landscape. Their presence reminds visitors that Homestead was never only one mill or one strike. It belonged to an industrial valley. The Monongahela Valley, the Pittsburgh region, and the surrounding counties formed one of the central landscapes of America's rise into the Age of Steel. Rivers of Steel's National Heritage Area covers 8 southwestern Pennsylvania counties: Allegheny, Armstrong, Beaver, Butler, Fayette, Greene, Washington, and Westmoreland. That scale is important because the history of Homestead cannot be contained within the borough line. The mills, mines, rail lines, rivers, furnaces, and worker neighborhoods were part of a connected industrial order. And the question Homestead leaves behind is also larger than Homestead. Who had the right to control production in a modern industrial economy? Could workers bargain as organized participants in that economy, or would they be treated as individuals who could be replaced when they resisted? When private force failed, what role would the state play? Would public authority stand between labor and capital, or would it secure the conditions under which production could resume? These were not abstract questions in 1892. They were lived at the mill gate, on the riverbank, in the streets, and inside the homes of people whose livelihoods depended on steel. The answers changed over time. The later rise of successful steel unionism through the Steelworkers Organizing Committee in the late 1930s shows that Homestead was not the final word on labor in steel, but it was a long silence between defeat and return. That silence is part of the meaning of the strike. Today, the remaining sites do not ask visitors to hear only the noise of battle. They ask for attention to what came before and after, the negotiations that failed, the fence that turned a workplace into a fortress, the barges that moved in darkness, the dead, the surrendered, the occupied town, the restarted mill, and the decades of weakened union power that followed. Homestead endures because it reveals the American industrial order at a moment when its lines were still being drawn but already hardening. It shows ambition, fear, discipline, violence, solidarity, and calculation. It shows how a local conflict can become a national memory. And it shows that defeat, when it comes at the right pressure point in history, can echo for generations. The river moved on. The mill landscape changed. The Steel Age rose, transformed the country, and left behind furnaces, foundations, landmarks, and scars. But at Homestead, the past remains unusually close to the surface. In the pump house, the Bost building, the Homestead labyrinth, the Carey blast furnaces, and the wider Rivers of Steel National Heritage Area, the story is still there to be read. Not as a simple victory, not as a simple loss, as a record of power and of the people who challenged it.